Well, thank you for joining us. We're actually continuing our series on the minor prophets called Majoring in the Minors, and we're doing it here on this format. Ron's talking with us through the financial series on Sundays, but we decided we just cover a few more of the minor prophets right here on this video cast, and so we're going to keep doing that. There are minor prophets that cover 12 writings we have right at the end of our Old Testament. And they're not called minor prophets because they are less important.
Why are they called minor prophets?
They just wrote less.
Yeah.
They're just collections are a lot shorter. Malachi today is it's 4 chapters. That's what we're talking today. And it's not even the shortest of the minor prophets.
What is the shortest one?
Obadiah. At 1 chapter. Actually, I believe Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament. And I know I didn't compare it to, I believe Jude would be the shortest one in the New Testament. But I don't know. They're probably rivaling for the shortest books
in the Bible.
In the Bible, one of those two. I'm not sure which one is actually shorter. Anyway, so let's look into Malachi for today, and we're just going to see what's going on. So Malachi's writing to Israel about 100 years after they've returned from Babylonian exile.
So just as a timeline, then we've seen the Israelites get rescued from Egypt. They travel through the desert for 40 years. They go into the promised land. There's a series of prophets. They have kings. They break their covenant with God. They get taken off into exile at Babylon for
about 70 years.
For about 70 years. And now this is they return to Israel, but this is 100 years after that.
Yeah, that's right. So that's 70 years. They return to Israel. Yeah, that's right. 100 years after that. And when you look at the 2 minor prophets that we see right before Malachi, and Malachi is the last book in our Old Testament, the last 2, both Haggai and Zechariah, they're talking to Israel, again, the returned Israel, that they've come out of the Babylon after 70 years. And they're talking roughly 15 years after. And that what they chiefly are doing is ultimately encouraging the Israelites to continue to rebuild the temple, because there's the 15-year stall on that rebuild. Sure. And, there's a desire because of God to have that built, because it really is a symbol of God being present with them, which is a really important thing that he wants the Israelites to remember. So
at the time of Malachi writing, then, the temple has been rebuilt and is functioning for sacrifices the way it was before.
Exactly. Things are sort of back to, quote unquote, as normal as they're going to get in the fact that they're still under Persian rule and things like that.
So it wasn't quite the glory of Solomon, but we're back to a functioning temple.
Exactly. And so when Malachi's writing, we have that rebuilt temple, but the problem seems to be, again, more of the idea of neglect.
Okay.
So he's writing to both the general population and the leaders that would be kind of there, as well as the priests, because those were very important community leaders. And there is no king. So it's a little different than we'd seen a lot of the other ones before the return. For the Israelites to Judah and Jerusalem and whatnot, there is no king that they're talking to. So
right, and essentially part of the king's role back when there was a king in Israel was to fund the upkeep of the temple, or impose taxes or whatever they do
all the stuff
to make that happen. Where in this case, they don't have a king, so it's up to the leaders and the priests working together to raise the money and do the work, which wasn't happening. Yeah,
that's right. They were not bringing offering and tithes to the temple, which is important, kind of really for 2 reasons. One is the upkeep of the temple and for the priests and Levites who are carrying out the duties that come with the things that come with the temple, upkeep and sacrifices and all that, as well as the stuff in proceeds coming in through offering and tithes is also to help care for those in need. So the orphans, the widows, and those foreigners, aliens, if you will, coming into the land.
So just for clarification's sake, those who may not know, what's a tithe?
It's essentially the way it was presented through the Old Testament and through the law was 10% of kind of your annual, crops and money and all that sort of stuff, and you bring that. It's called first fruits. It's that first 10%, and it's a lot of it is to help do that, but it's also gratitude that God is the provider, and that He, and whatever we have He's provided for that.
Good. Yep.
So they haven't really been doing that. The other thing too, when it comes to sacrifices, which is a part of what happens at the temple, they were bringing in basically animals that were expendable.
So what kind of animals should they have been bringing?
Well, they're supposed to, again, according to the law. This is really a important maybe note just to hit right here. Quite often when the prophets are dealing with Israel, they are covenant centric.
Sure.
And so part of the covenant, so that relational agreement, was when it came to sacrifices, they were supposed to bring an unblemished animal. And they're not doing that. They're actually bringing sick animals. And so,
or animals they don't care about.
Essentially, yeah.
Or care about losing.
They're expendable.
And how is that a problem for God in this?
Well, a lot of it, it's representational of the idea of an animal that has no defect is sort of the sin offering, the idea. And that's kind of just the idea that it's an animal that's whole.
Sure. And you're giving your best to God, not your your least or worst.
Right. And being that this is not just an issue of the people, it's the priests who are basically saying, hey, it's perfectly fine. Yeah. I'll accept this. This is good. They're a part of this whole thing. And what we kind of have here is with past prophets who are taking issue with worship practices, who were a little different. They were before they were taking issue with worship practices, not because they were phoning it in. It was quite the opposite. They were quite elaborate in what they're doing, really showing off their wealth and really look how wonderful I am by the feasts that I'm doing, and all for God.
I'll sacrifice 7 bulls instead of 1 bull.
Well, exactly. And it is all they were compensating because they were really oppressing and inflicting injustice on the vulnerable. So they were like, hey, look how good this is, in a way like, hey, look at what else we're doing. Here we have this idea they're kind of just phoning it in. So
it's become very laissez-faire.
Yeah, lackluster.
Whatever, just we're going through the motions.
Yeah, and actually in the African Bible commentary, and I don't know if I'm going to get this name right, so I apologize for that, Yoela Lipet, he wrote this, and I thought it was pretty strong. And when he's talking about God, he said he prefers no worship to irreverent or hypocritical worship.
Right. Okay. That's a pretty strong.
That's a strong statement. Yeah. It's just hey, if you're going to do it this way, and you do see that, he's not happy with this sort of lackluster approach to that worship, and he wasn't happy to the overabundance that they were giving him, before the exile, while they were oppressing the poor and the vulnerable. And he just hey, it's irreverent and hypocritical. I'd rather you just not do it at all if you're going to do it that way. So again, because of this, we are seeing this, what seems to be, or coming across to me anyway, is apathy. Although Malachi is not addressing any rampant oppression, like we see other prophets again speaking into, I'm pretty sure it's probably still present, but it doesn't seem to be quite as big. But there is a thing going on here where you start to see a little bit of oppression, is that it's in chapter 2, Malachi deals with the priests who are showing favoritism. And by doing that, they're discriminating between the rich and the poor. And so as much as that we may not see, again, the rampant oppression that we kind of saw posted, it's not better. It's still this issue, and strangely enough, it's kind of the issue that James will talk about when his letter in the New Testament, favoritism again and again. So favoritism towards the rich at the expense of the poor, and kind of we see a lot of that. Kind of it's carried on quite a lot there. And so it is a way that, again, maybe not quite as rampant as we saw before, but its injustice still the same.
Yeah, and it maybe is simple here where they're giving preference to the highest bidder. So, lots of people, have to come to Jerusalem to make the sacrifice. Yep. There's obviously going to be all the people in the whole country at the same time trying to make sacrifices. So the injustice here could be as simple as, I don't have to wait in line because I'm rich. I'll pay to get to jump the queue.
Yep. There's a lot of things that they've been going on there. But again, we see the priests who are supposed to be a servant to the people and who are supposed to be very mindful of the vulnerable, doing the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And again, which just really heaps shame upon the temple and ultimately the presence of God.
And that's really, we see Israel again falling into the category maybe of unfaithfulness. They're not keeping up their end of the covenant, and it's not the first time. This is again. No,
it seems to be. Hey, we're doing the exact same thing, like as was done before.
So they really haven't learned their lesson from the exile.
And I think that's the thing. Is like they haven't learned their lesson. And once again, in not learning the lesson, it's the vulnerable who end up suffering the most out of it. So I think when we look at the idea, kind of if there's with the idea of apathy being the kind of the major theme that seems to be here, I think it kind of, as you sort of said, it talks about really that apathy is leading to a sense of unfaithfulness.
Sure.
They're not keeping up their end of the bargain again, and I do find it fascinating that Malachi addresses the unfaithfulness of some of the men in Israel. They're divorcing their wives in order to marry these other women. And one of the things with some of these other women is they're not Israelites, and they're bringing in their religious idols. This happened before too. And they're bringing those religious idols and they're bringing it alongside God.
Which is a direct violation of the covenant.
Again, another direct violation. What I really find fascinating, I think, about this is that because I find it kind of becomes representative of God's relationship with Israel at the time. And in chapter 2, verse 14, this is what Malachi writes. He says, "You cry out, why doesn't the Lord accept my worship?" And he says, "I tell you why. Because the Lord witnessed the vows you and your wife made when you were young. But you have been unfaithful to her." And here's the emphasis: "though she remains your faithful partner."
Right.
The wife of your marriage vows. And I think what's really important that we see here, we see this contrast of faithful and unfaithful. I think that's what we need to really look at throughout a lot of the minor prophets, especially here with Malachi, is that this contrast that's going on, faithful and unfaithful, faithful and unfaithful. And I kind of take it as when we take that context in God being faithful, and we take it, look at the wives being called faithful, I'm guessing they did more than just not cheat. They kept up whatever, especially in that time, in that place, which is definitely different than ours, but we still have those, in our marriages and relationships.
Expectations.
Well, there's expectations, but I think sometimes it's more than just not cheating.
Yeah.
There's more to keeping up the relational, just simply not cheating.
There's a lot more to having a relationship than not cheating.
Exactly. Yes. And there's a lot of things we can do that beyond not cheating. That can really be damaging into a relationship. And I really find that interesting is basically I really feel about it. Hey, they were faithful. So they've kept up their end of the bargain in all that it means to be in a relationship. They've kept it. And he's looking at those men, and you aren't. You didn't. You are unfaithful. They are faithful. And again, it's that whole idea going back to God. God is faithful. He has remained faithful. He's kept up his end of the relationship, and he keeps up his end of the covenant.
Even though Israel is not.
Absolutely. At the beginning of Malachi, when it's sort of God's giving sort of answers to Israelites' question on whether God actually loves them, he points them back to his choosing of them through the descendant of Jacob over the descendants of Esau.
Sure.
And it was his grace and his love, not anything Jacob did. And then it's kind of his faithfulness extends from that choice. And then when we move to the end of Malachi, we see his promise that he's going to call that remnant of people there, and they would be, and he uses some of these words, they would be his own special treasure. They would experience healing, and they would experience freedom and joy.
And I think this speaks to God's character. The remnant may or may not be people who maybe were still faithful, but God is still giving them a chance to repent and give them a chance to fulfill their end of the bargain.
Yeah.
And so, there's I think that's a wonderful picture of God's character, that he is willing to continue the relationship.
Yeah, and I think what it really comes down to when it comes to his character, it's the whole idea that's not his faithfulness is not really the thing in question.
No, yeah.
It's really the thing we got to look at is one, his hope, but it's more ours as those who are followers of him.
Sure.
And his hope always will remain that we will remain in faithfulness to him, or at least return to faithfulness in him.
That's kind of the overarching story or God's story that we see in the Bible.
Yeah. And so I think that we hope that it's hoped that as a people, as Israel, and I think even for us today, that we return from a place of apathy, that we remain or return to faithfulness. And that can look, I think for us now, it kind of look in different ways. Obviously, there's not a temple, there's not all those things that we see here. But I mean, we have different ways we connect with God, and we want to being followers of him in a way, in certain ways that are helpful for that. So it might be a return to spiritual disciplines, things like adding regular prayer and reading of the Bible in our lives, coming back to a place of community.
Sure. And I think for me personally, there's been seasons of my life where I did feel this way.
Yeah.
It felt like going to church. I still went to church, and I was going through the motions. I brought my family. We went to church. We did our thing, and but anybody that was looking at me from inside the church community would think everything was okay.
Right.
But really, my relationship with God was either in trouble or pretty much non-existent in certain parts. And it wasn't until I started to focus on that again and get my relationship right that the worship actually became meaningful again.
Right. And I think that's I think a wonderful way sometimes that is. My story is not really any different. It is just coming back into some of those things. And it's not to feel bad that we get to a place of apathy. It's just let's return. And that might take some time and that might take some healing.
Yep. And I think you hit on the term community there, and it's imperfect. Any community is imperfect because there's people in it. Yeah. But I think community is really the only way where we have, and we've talked about this in our previous series, where we can have healthy correction so that we don't get too far off track. Anytime we're left alone, we're going to wander, I think, and to the point of either oblivion or even danger in our relationship with God, where being a part of a community where people have your back and they know you well enough to know something's wrong, that there can be a chance to not go too far down that path without someone saying, "Hey, are you okay? What can I do to help you get back on track?"
Well, and I think it's where in those communities where we experience Hesed.
Sure.
And there's this I can't remember the name of the song. I think it's called "Floating in the Night." It's Judah the Lion put out a new album called "The Process." Fantastic album. And one of the lines, and I really related to it, that because the whole album is about the process of grief, and so he goes through the 5 stages of grief. And one of the line in that, I think it's floating on the rope in the night or something like that. The line is, and I really fighting as you're going through some of the anger and denial stuff. Like you're fighting with your friends for no reason. And I was like, like when that line came out, I was like, wow, I can really relate to that. So much so. But I think what happens is I really, as I heard that line, Hesed can be met in that moment, in that as you're going through grief and you're fighting with your friends for no reason, they're sticking with you, knowing you're going through stuff.
So we've used the word Hesed quite a lot, but for those who might be just tuning in today,
it's got a really good plan.
What is Hesed?
It's attachment love.
Yeah.
And again, it's not that we're, there could be healthy correction in that, because there's a point where you lovingly bring correction. If you're fighting with your friends for no reason, you want to make sure you're not hurtful in all that. But it's those moments that you're going to feel beautiful Hesed in this imperfect yet growing in health community, which we want to be. And
I think we've always said that even in the previous series, that Hesed is the ingredient, the attachment love, or a place where you feel like you belong, is actually key to have in place before healthy correction
Absolutely,
can happen.
100%.
So, like you said, when you have a history with a community of people that love you, even if you do get to a place in grief or other emotions where maybe you do lash out a bit hurtfully, they're the ones who are going to be able to take it and still love you.
Yeah. And I think the other thing I think is, and I really want to maybe make sure we say this is a spiritual discipline. And it's, I think, is really important in the idea of how we return and not stay in a place of apathy as we start to relook how we treat others.
Sure.
This is a spiritual discipline. I really want to say, like, I think sometimes we kind of remove it from that because it's not prayer or fasting or reading the Bible or singing a song. How we treat others is absolutely spiritual discipline. If we look through the minor prophets, God takes a lot of issue with this, especially when it comes to the idea of loving our neighbor and loving our enemy.
And I completely agree with that statement. It is a spiritual discipline. In fact, if we look at sort of infer what we're saying there is that this is something that can be part of your apathy, can actually hold back your worship because you're not treating people the way you're supposed to, and God isn't happy with that.
Yeah. And dare I say, even if you're praying and reading every day, but you're treating others terribly, we really need to relook at that.
Yep, absolutely.
You don't get a pass.
Yeah, I was just about to say, well, we've all known that mean person who is very, seemed very religious, but sometimes that person is in the mirror.
Yeah. So going back to that when we talk about Hesed and that attachment love, this is what we see Malachi even in the midst of all this, even in his corrections that he's giving to the Israelite people. At the end, he's establishing God's Hesed, that faithfulness, that attachment love, even in the midst of, hey, you guys are messing up again. Let me remind you, I'm still going to be there.
Yeah, God's faithfulness is not just, I said I was going to do it, so I'm going to do it. It's motivated by love.
It is.
And that's really, again, very consistent in the Old Testament even, and we don't always think of it that way when we think of God's character. So anyway, thanks very much for watching today. We enjoy talking like this and going through, in this case, the book of Malachi in the Old Testament. Sometimes we kind of overlook those books. They're not always the on top of our reading list, but again, there's always things we can learn. It always Jesus talked about the minor prophets and quoted them often, and we can see when we start looking at them closely, we see God's character and Jesus' character in these particular books. And the lesson from today about apathy is that our relationship with God can become apathetic. And sometimes we need to give our relationship a kickstart by praying and reading the Bible and being part of a loving community. And as we just talked about, maybe we need to take a very close look at how we treat others, especially our neighbors and even our enemies. So thanks again for watching today. Please like and subscribe. We like to keep bringing you this kind of content. And thanks again. We'll see you next time.